prison gates groaned open, their rusted hinges echoing through the humid Florida air. Sidney Holmes stepped forward, the weight of 34 years pressing against his shoulders. The sun was bright, too bright, after decades of filtered daylight through wire mesh windows. His sister's sob broke the silence. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him as if to make sure he was real. Holmes closed his eyes and held her tightly. The voices of reporters swirled in the distance, but his mind was already drifting back to the day everything began, the day his life was stolen. It was June 19th, 1988, Father's Day. Broward County shimmered under a punishing summer heat. The air smelled of gasoline and ocean salt. Sidney, 23 years old, was behind the wheel of his brown 1970s Oldsmobile Cutlass, headed toward his family's gathering. His father was already in the backyard marinating ribs. He didn't know that just a few miles away, two men were preparing for a crime that would change his life forever. Outside a convenience store, a man and woman returned to their car after a quick stop. Before they could get in, two armed men ambushed them. One brandished a revolver, the other barked orders. The victims handed over their valuables, fear thick in the air. The robbers fled in what the victims would later describe as a brown two-door car with a white roof. That was all it took. The next day, the male victim's brother spotted a car he thought matched the description. A brown Oldsmobile Cutlass. That car belonged to Sidney Holmes. It didn't matter that the Cutlass was common in the area. It didn't matter that Sidney had been with his family for hours during the time of the robbery. The seed of suspicion had been planted. When police brought Holmes in for questioning, he didn't hesitate. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, so he spoke freely. "I was with my family. It was Father's Day. You can ask them," he told detectives. But as the days went on, the case against him began to take shape, built not on hard evidence, but on the shifting sands of human memory. The victims were first shown a photo lineup. They didn't pick Sidney. Weeks later, detectives arranged another lineup, this time a live one. The conditions were flawed. Holmes stood out. The victims pointed to him. That identification became the backbone of the prosecution's case. In the courtroom, Holmes's public defender argued that eyewitness memory was unreliable, for family members swore Sidney had been with them at the time of the robbery. But the jury believed the confident testimony of the victims. The verdict came in April 1989, guilty on armed robbery charges. The sentence shocked even seasoned court reporters. 400 years in prison. The number was symbolic, a message from the judge that Holmes would never walk free again. Holmes sat in the courtroom, numb. For centuries, he would die behind bars. For the victims, justice had been served. For Sidney, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Prison became his world. Days blurred into years, years into decades. The sound of metal doors clanging shut at night became the lullaby he hated. Holmes refused to let his mind rot. He studied theology. He earned degrees in ministry and legal studies. He learned the language of appeals, post-conviction relief, and wrongful conviction law. Every letter he sent to lawyers and innocence organizations carried the same message. "I am innocent. I can prove it." Most never wrote back. Some did, but politely declined. Florida's legal system had no easy mechanism for revisiting old convictions. Once appeals were exhausted, most cases stayed closed forever. Holmes's was no different. Still, he persisted. In the early 2000s, he filed pro se motions, handwritten appeals, arguing the eyewitness identifications were flawed and that the lineup was improperly conducted. The courts rejected him again and again. His father died before seeing his son free. His grandmother passed away without another hug. His daughter grew up and had a child of her own while he remained in a cell. In late 2020, a new hope emerged. The Broward County State Attorney's Office had recently created a conviction review unit, the CRU, dedicated to reinvestigating questionable cases. Holmes wrote them a letter. It landed on the desk of Assistant State Attorney Arielle Denby-Berger. She read it carefully, noting that Holmes had served over 3 decades on eyewitness evidence alone, with no physical proof. She agreed to open the case. The CRU started digging. They pulled the original police reports, examined the lineup photos, and reread trial transcripts. They spoke to the original victims. Something didn't add up. The car description? Flawed. The victims had initially disagreed on key details. The timeline of the robbery didn't match the timeline of Holmes's movements that day. The procedures used in the second lineup violated best practices. And then came the shocker. New evidence suggested the real getaway car might have been a completely different make and model. Holmes didn't know it yet, but his case was about to turn upside down. It was a Friday afternoon when Berger's office received a long-forgotten envelope from a retired detective's personal files. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten notes, and a single yellowed document labeled. The first name on that list was not Sidney Holmes, and one of those names was still alive. The envelope felt heavier than its contents. Arielle Denby Berger sat alone in her office, the late afternoon sun slicing across her desk. She turned over the yellowed page again, her eyes fixed on the words alternate suspects, confidential. There were 3 names listed. None of them belonged to Sidney Holmes. Each had been questioned briefly in 1988 and released. The notes in the margin told an even more troubling story. The primary suspect had a criminal history for armed robbery. Another was linked to a string of convenience store holdups in the months before Holmes's arrest. The third? A known associate of the first 2. So why had this been buried? The CRU traced the handwriting on the notes to Detective Raymond Keller, the original case investigator. Keller had retired over a decade ago, but his memory was sharp. When reached by phone, his voice was weary. "Yeah, I remember the case," he said. "But once the victims picked Holmes out of that lineup, the brass told me to focus on him. Said we had our guy." Berger's pen froze mid-scribble. "You're telling me you stopped investigating the other names because the victims identified Holmes?" "That's the way it worked back then," Keller admitted. "I didn't like it, but orders are orders." The CRU re-interviewed the victims. Decades had passed. Their memories were shadows of what they once were. "I'm not sure anymore," the female victim confessed quietly. "Back then, they told us we'd done the right thing, that we'd helped put him away. But now, after all these years," she shook her head. "It's hard to say." The male victim was less certain, but admitted he couldn't remember if Holmes had facial hair in the lineup, something that could have set him apart from others. Berger's team scoured the evidence locker. No fingerprints, no weapon, no stolen property ever linked to Holmes. Not even a photo of him near the convenience store. What they did find was an internal memo, dated before Holmes's trial, noting that the Oldsmobile Cutlass described by the victims might actually have been a Pontiac Grand Prix. Similar body shape, but different enough to matter. That memo had never been given to the defense. Holmes's alibi, dismissed at trial, was re-examined. His family's testimony had been consistent for 34 years. He was at the house from early afternoon until well after dark. A neighbor remembered seeing the Oldsmobile parked outside. CRU investigators ran the robbery's timeline against traffic patterns from 1988 and found something startling. Holmes would have had to drive at impossible speeds to commit the robbery and return in time to be seen at his family's home. Under the CRU protocol, cases with new evidence of possible wrongful conviction went to an independent review panel made up of former judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. The panel's members gathered in a conference room, stacks of files in front of them. "This is thin," one retired judge remarked after skimming the trial transcript. "No physical evidence, flawed eyewitness ID, suppressed alternate suspect list. This never should have gone to trial." When the vote came, it was unanimous. Reasonable doubt existed. The conviction should be vacated. It was early March 2023 when Berger picked up the phone to call Holmes's attorney from the Innocence Project of Florida, Seth Miller. "We're moving to vacate," she told him. "We're filing to dismiss the charges entirely." Miller paused, his voice catching. "Sidney needs to hear this from you." Minutes later, Holmes was summoned from his cell. The phone on the wall crackled to life. "Mr. Holmes," Berger said, "you're going home." There was silence on the other end. Then, the sound of a man struggling to breathe through tears. On March 13, 2023, Holmes walked out of the Broward County main jail. The crowd of reporters was there, but his eyes were only for his family. His sister clutched his arm. His niece, now grown, hugged him fiercely. "I knew this day would come," he told the microphones. "I never lost hope. Not once." Freedom was both sweet and strange. Holmes marveled at smartphones, the internet, and the speed of everyday life. But the years were gone, stolen. "I lost my father, my grandmother. I lost raising my daughter," he told a local paper. "No amount of money can replace that." Still, he began to rebuild. He spoke at churches, schools, and community groups about resilience and faith. He started drafting a book about his journey. In 2025, Florida lawmakers debated whether Holmes should receive compensation under the state's wrongful incarceration law, $50,000 for each year served. His supporters argued it was the bare minimum for such a grievous mistake. After months of political wrangling, the bill passed. Governor Ron DeSantis signed it into law. Holmes would receive roughly $1.72 million, plus educational benefits. Holmes accepted the award, but his eyes stayed fixed on the bigger battle, helping others like him. Holmes founded a small nonprofit dedicated to assisting prisoners who claimed innocence. One letter stood out: a man in another Florida prison who had been convicted in the late 90s under eerily similar circumstances. No physical evidence, a single eyewitness ID, and alternate suspects ignored. Holmes set the letter aside, but that night he couldn't stop thinking about it. The handwriting was shaky, but the desperation was familiar. Late one evening, Holmes sat at his desk, the letter in front of him. He opened his laptop and searched the man's name. A few clicks brought up an old news article, and there it was, buried in the second paragraph. The lead detective on that case, Raymond Keller, the same man who had once told Holmes, "Orders are orders." Holmes leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in Florida, another man might be living the same nightmare he had just escaped. And this time, Sidney Holmes knew exactly how the system could bury the truth.